in the name of God, who brings laughter into the world, so that everyone who hears it can laugh together. Amen. It was Saint Irenaeus in the 2nd century who famously quipped, "The glory of God is the human person fully alive." The glory of God is the human person fully alive. If you, like me, have experienced these past couple of weeks with the weightiness and the heartbreak, you may be wondering right now, what does it mean to be fully alive? In fact, beyond that, even at a more fundamental level, you may just be asking, what does it mean right now to even be human, let alone fully alive? I still remember well my college experience working for the housing department. And of course, in the housing department, the way it works there is that everything is a group process. We don't ever learn by sitting and reading a book or listening to a lecture. The way that we learn things in the housing department where I went to college is that everything was a group process, a group challenge. And we would do these low ropes course challenges, right? That the learning was something more than just cerebral, but they'd give us a challenge and they'd say, figure it out. No directions, no real sense other than the desired outcome, which was typically you need to get from point A to point B and you have this obstacle in your way. Right? They'd give us a basic challenge, and the task was to figure out among us in the group, how do we get from point A to point B? It was typical in a group like this that certain personalities and certain skill sets were privileged over others. It was often the case that the most assertive in the room would show up and go straight to fixing, right? There must be a logical way to get from point A to point B. And we would do the process, everyone would fall in line, and we would soon discover that while getting from point A to point B with that skill set may have worked for some of the folks in the room, it did not work for everyone. And we would often get to point B only to look back and realize we did not have enough resources to get the rest of the folks from point A across the obstacle. So back we'd go, we'd start over, and we'd retool again. And of course, the great learning in all of this is that every challenge benefits by having all the gifts in the room tend to the challenge, right? That there are certain ones that we privilege, certain ones that we marginalize, and that the goal of every healthy group is to make sure that it's taking advantage of the full repertoire of gifts that it's been given to tend to the challenge in front of us. Now, fortunately, most of those were not deadly serious. They were fun challenges. And so in a sense then, in the context of learning was really the context of play. We knew that our lives were not really at stake, despite the fact that we were wading across crocodile-infested waters or across hot lava. We knew that our lives were not fundamentally at risk, right? So we did not have the pressures of that sort of deadly challenge in front of us. It was play, right? It was play, and it was oftentimes, once we would settle down, the need to solve the problem and to get there as quickly as possible, once we got back to play, we came to realize there were ways to do this thing that we would have never imagined if the goal was simply speed or efficiency. But when the goal is play, to make sure everyone's involved, new possibilities would arise. My guru in the midst of any challenge I feel, particularly organizational challenge or cultural challenge, when I feel myself stuck, the guy I go to is Ed Friedman. And if you haven't read his Failure of Nerve, please get his Failure of Nerve and just read it, particularly in this moment right now. He is the one who translated Murray Bowen's family systems work into organizational work. And Ed Friedman has this great insight about what happens in groups of people who come together and find themselves with a challenge in front of them that is, at least in all appearances, more than they can deal with, right? When they get stressed out, when they get afraid, when they lose sleep, when they start to turn on one another and become what he says is reactive. his insight in all of this is that the very first gift that we've all been given that helps us have a container within which to solve any problem that comes our way, the first gift that we lose in the midst of challenge, particularly when we're afraid and anxious and stressed out, is playfulness. He says, until you can recover playfulness, you will never solve the problem in any sustainable way, because it's playfulness that helps us access that part of ourselves that is more than just the lizard brain that is looking out for mere survival, right, or self-preservation. That when we're stressed out, while we jump back to the lizard brain, which he calls the reptilian mind, he says, think about a reptile. They are not typically perceived to be playful critters the way, say, a puppy might be. He says what you have to do is fight off the urge. You have to work through the deep instinct to get to problem solving for just mere survival and self-preservation. And the only way to do that is to force our way back into a playful disposition. And so he says, if we're going to really do more than just survive, but we're going to thrive and sustain, we have to recover the disposition of playfulness, right? We have to bring our whole selves to the work, not just that little lizard part that merely wants to survive. Learned all that in small group stuff in college. That brings us to this sort of jarring story this morning from Genesis. And the reason I'm focusing on this jarring story from Genesis is because these last several months, certainly these last 3 weeks, have been a deadly serious challenge for all of us. We have experienced a weightiness to the pressures that are in front of us, to the challenges in front of us. It is not obvious what the solutions are, though many of us jump quickly to fixing. Many of us jump quickly to that deep, deep instinct within all of us to settle for mere survival or for mere self-preservation. And we come to discover that there's a tension in that, right? There's a flatness to it. There's a lack of sustainable energy to it because we're all so deadly serious. And this is a deadly serious moment. And yet, when we look around ourselves and we look at the real pros of resistance, when we pay attention to those folks who've been tending to moments like this for a long time, we come to discover that there's this beautiful playfulness. It shows up in art, shows up in music and dance, shows up in poetry. So we've got this story from Genesis about laughter. It plops down into the midst of this deadly serious moment in our community and in our nation, and in fact in our world. We've got this story about the matriarch of all peoples who laughs. I kind of wanted to dodge it, but it kept grabbing me and pulling me back to the story. We know a little bit about this story, the story of Abram and Sarai, who receive an initial promise. Abram picks everything up and he wanders because he's given a great promise in a new land. Pull up stakes, go to this new place, and you will be the father of nations, right? Your offspring will be like the sands of the beach. You won't be able to count them, right? There's a promise years ago, prior to the story that we have this morning. And so we come to this morning's story with a matriarch and a patriarch who have potentially grown a little cynical. It would make sense that they're a little tired. It would make sense that they're a little stressed out because they've been given a promise, and not just given the promise, but given a specific role within the promise to be the father and the mother of all the nations. No pressure. So here we are, we come to discover in chapter 17, the one just before this, that they're 99 years old. And they get the promise again that we will make it so with Sarai as we had promised. Now Sarah, now Abraham. Their names have been changed, but they have not fulfilled the promise. The promise has not been fulfilled within them and through them and among them. They're still waiting. Abraham, we know the story of. A particular skill set, he goes to problem solving. I don't want to overgender this, but he's He's problem solving. He's figuring out, well, I know that part of the promise here is that I'm supposed to have kids, right? So we know the story of Hagar and Ishmael, the wonderful provision God makes eventually, but they're marginalized because that's not the original promise. The original promise is with Abraham and Sarah, that somehow between the two of them, even at the ripe age of 99, God will fulfill the promise. So we can imagine them on this beautiful hot day in the shade of the trees. They come to discover at this point in their life, though they can't control outcomes, what they can do is show up to life in a meaningful way. And the way they show up is in good hospitality. That's all they do. They extend good hospitality. They see 3 visitors and they go running. What can we do to take care of you? Lord, he refers to them. What can we do to take good care of you? Come back. Let us take care of you. Let us give you water to wash. Let us give you water to drink. Let us give you food to eat. Let us give you shade to rest within. Hospitality. In the midst of that hospitality, we go then panning over to the story of Sarah, who is asked to bake bread. And in the midst of baking bread from the far distant room, she hears the conversation, right, between Abraham and the 3 visitors. And it's reminded of them again that this great thing is going to happen through Sarah. And she knows herself to be old. She considers herself to be well beyond the capacity for any more pleasure in life. Could there ever be joy again for this one who had a promise given, but it has yet to be fulfilled? And so she hears the promise again, and she laughs instinctively, nervously, perhaps, maybe even cynically. She laughs. She could have gotten enraged. She could have wept. She could have stormed out of the house. She could have done any number of understandable things, but instead what came out of her naturally was laughter. I can't help but see in that instinct to laughter an instinct to playfulness, that there's a levity that does something within us to open us up to God's possibilities. There's a levity that's required of us to bear the heavy burdens of God's promises, to be hope bearers in the world that regularly disappoints, that is regularly radically dissonant from what God says God's going to do and what is actually happening in the world. We're well aware of the dissonance between the now and the not yet. And we live in that time of waiting for the fulfillment of the promise. Any number of responses would make sense. And in fact, over the course of dealing with the dissonance between the now and the not yet, we have to have all those responses. It's legitimate for folks to feel rage. It's legitimate for folks to feel helpless. It is legitimate for folks to just want to curl up in a ball and take a nap. And it is legitimate, and in fact, this story reminds us it is not only legitimate but essential that we retain the capacity to playfulness, that we not allow ourselves to revert to that just mere survival and self-preservation instinct, but that we stay open to the possibilities of the fulfillment of God's promises, that we have to be able to laugh or else we would cry at the lack of the fulfillment of God's promise. There's something about playfulness and laughter that allows us to be people of hope. And yet, as Friedman reminds us, in times like these, laughter, playfulness, is the first gift to go. It is the first thing we lose, and yet we know it is the most essential. Sarah, the matriarch of all the nations, the bearer of heartbreak, the bearer of good humor, the bearer of hope for all of us. While it's reckoned as faith to Abraham that he would simply say yes, it is reckoned as faith, maintaining of hope for Sarah, that she would laugh at the possibilities. And so it is, we hear in the story that a mere year later, we're told 100 years old, they're the proud parents of a new child, Isaac. Laughter incarnate. Laughter incarnate. Sarah reminds us that when there's nothing else we can do, when we feel helpless or hopeless, impotent to the powers all around us, she reminds us of the generative power of play, the generative power of art and of beauty, of poetry, of dance. She reminds us that those things have power, that they're not superficial. It is not a form of avoidance. It is a form of reminder that we have all of this within us and it has power. And in fact, if you pay attention to what happens in repressive empires, the first thing they go after, and look at our own record in the last 3 years, is the arts. There is no accident. It is intentional. Art, play, laughter is power. Our present moment begs us to pay attention to the demands of the whole person. It begs us to look around us and among us and within us at the gifts we've each been given to contribute to the fulfillment of God's promises. Some of us should be working political process. Some of us should be imagining reform. Some of us should be turning tables over. Some of us should be enraged and demanding the resignation of key leaders among us. And some of us should be at that beautiful space at 38th and Chicago making art. That's what we should be doing. That is what that space is. It is a thin space, and there's people the globe over who are coming to visit it right here in our own city, a mere 23 blocks to the south of us. Our thin place where tragedy had the possibility of diminishing us. It had the possibility of making us revert to our reptilian brains where we would be satisfied with mere survival and self-preservation. And that space, that holy sanctuary, is a sanctuary of hope. It is a sanctuary of beauty. It is a sanctuary of play. It is a sanctuary even of laughter. And it reminds us, not only do you deserve all of this, you have been made for all of this, but God has promised all of this as well. Promised it to us, promised it to our children and grandchildren, promised it to all generations. And we have this moment now to make sure that we don't lose that capacity, that we not allow ourselves to be dehumanized and flattened into mere reptiles. We are made for so much more than that. It has been said, it's been said that when our neighbor and our brother, George Floyd, it's been said that when he cried for his mama, that every mother was summoned. Every mother, every matriarch, everyone who laughs in the face of the power of death, everyone who bears hope in the midst of a world that is growing hopeless and cynical, all of those mothers were summoned. Well, I guess the prayer for us would be then, having been summoned, each of us, having been reminded of this story of who we are and how we're to be in the world as fully human and fully alive, people who laugh and who play, who demand the fullness of life, I guess we might pray that all mothers that all of us with them, that we too would receive the gift of this kind of laughter, so that they and that we with them, even in this instance, might have the last laugh indeed, even and especially as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Remember, friends, the glory of God is the human person fully alive. Amen.